Well, good morning. It's Monday morning, and we had a break. So let's pretend that nothing is happening in the world, and let's do some history. Well, I guess I sent your grades back, and we have a second assignment upcoming due on the 4th of March. It's quite important because it's really putting together the essay. And this is the key thing that you're doing during the semester. So, of course, you'll put together the essay, it'll be marked, it'll be returned to you, and then you'll have a chance to revise it and perfect it and submit it toward the end of term. And so if you do that in a reasonable way, you would know how to write the university essay. Are there any questions about the essay or any other matter?
How long should the essay be about, the rough draft?
Did I not specify the word count?
I don't think you did in the syllabus. Maybe I can recheck, but I thought I looked over it and I didn't see anything.
I think it should be between 2,000 and 3,000 words.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor.
Any other questions? Okay. So I would like to begin by doing another review question. And the review question is number 6. By the end of the 16th century, Europe was made up of a set of rival territorial states on a more or less permanent war footing. Was this a good thing or a bad thing? So, in answering this question, you'll remember that in the Middle Ages, there were no real territorial states in the Middle Ages. There was a pope, there was the emperor, and then there were some feudal kings. They really didn't have any power. At the beginning of the 16th century, we see that particularly in Spain, France, and England, and elsewhere, these powerful new states occupying a large territory with a king who controlled basically the military and the laws. We call this control over territory sovereignty. So these were territorial sovereign states, and the model states were England, France, and Spain. So you would want to mention those states, but you would also want to add that there were a number of other states, like we've already mentioned, a state like Portugal, but especially in, we can talk about the fact that there was a parallel state, the Kingdom of Denmark, the Kingdom of Sweden, but also a large number of states in Germany and Italy, like Florence was a state, Venice was a state, Milan was a state, Naples was a state, the papacy was a state. And in Germany, places like Saxony, Savoy, Brandenburg, these were all states. And these smaller states, they imitated as much as possible the large states of France, England, and Spain. And in fact, the small states were, in a way, dependencies of the larger states. It worked back then more or less the way it works now. In a sense, if you take a state like Russia, you see Belarus, see Kazakhstan, they are a smaller state, and they're dependent on Russia. Likewise, the example is the United States. Well, Canada or England are dependencies of the United States. Their sovereignty is limited, is what I would say. Now, what were the main characteristics of these territorial states? Well, there was usually a king. There was his court, the royal court, where it was attended by the nobles of the kingdom. But there was also a bureaucracy, which was largely devoted to collecting taxes and administering justice and taxes. These bureaucracies were a lot smaller than, say, the Canadian bureaucracy per capita, but they carried out many of the same functions. And then there was some sort of standing military force, artillery trained, army or navy. And these states controlled the church in their territory as well. So when you add it up, all of the focal points of power, justice, taxation, the military, the church, all of these were controlled by the king, the state authority. And the thing about these states was, in contrast to the Middle Ages, and even as late as the reign of Charles V, they sort of operated according to different principles. Because in the Middle Ages, the emperor the Pope was the leading spiritual authority, and the emperor was the leading temporal authority, secular authority. And you saw that Charles V, King of Spain, attempted to renew the power of the emperor in imitation of the Roman emperors. But this attempt, as we know, failed. And these territorial states operated according to different principles. And the principle was the balance of power, which was understood. It still operates today, the balance of power. And what it's all about is that preserving one's independence as a state was the most important thing for these rulers. So they would, in terms of diplomacy, if some state in Europe became too strong, like, for example, Spain in the 16th century, the other states, like England and France and some of their allies, would balance off the power of the King of Spain. And this became a basic principle of European and later on world diplomacy. So and this entailed diplomacy, but when diplomacy failed, war was the answer. And so we find that there were constant wars in Europe right through the early modern period. Does anybody have any questions? Okay. So this kind of organization was, on the one hand, quite destructive. You had wars all the time. Obviously, peasants, merchants, the common people will suffer. You see who's going to pay the price of this war in Ukraine, and indeed, who knows? It might spread even. It might spread. It might become a global war, for all I know. So the common people pay the price. They suffer. So it's obviously the question asked: was it a good or bad thing? This kind of politics. So obviously, in that respect, it was very bad. And furthermore, it was bad because war became more and more expensive as time progressed. You had the artillery trains, you had these huge fortifications, you had big navies emerging. All of that had to be paid for, and the way it was paid for was by raising taxes. And that meant that, again, the common people, the merchants, they paid the price. However, having said all that, obviously there's a lot of negative features of this system, and God knows we need, frankly, we need world government because it's reaching such a crazy point. But on the one hand, the rulers of these states, for example, Queen Elizabeth in England, we're talking about the latter part of the 16th century, or the ruler in France was Henry IV. They realized in order to get resources to fight these wars, they needed to develop their economies. And so in these two countries, and gradually it spread to the rest of Europe, the governments began to invest in economic development. And they began to encourage merchants and manufacturers to establish new industries. They set up tariffs. This is what we call mercantilism, economic development in behalf of the state. Are there any questions? That's the answer to that review question. Okay, I want to turn back to the narrative. Now, we left off with the humanists, the Italian humanists, and I noted that they lived in places like Milan and Venice, but especially in Florence. And these were not monarchies. They were republics, self-governing republics. And it was this, that meant that the people who ruled Venice and Florence were essentially merchants and bankers, rather than princes and nobles. And so the culture, this humanist culture that emerged, was the audience for it, the people who patronized it, were essentially the wealthy middle class in these towns. And the culture, as I explained, was basically, let's go back to the ancient world. The ancient world was a world of cities and towns, like Florence, like Venice. And we can find the principles according to which we should act politically and even morally by studying the histories, the philosophies of the ancient classical writers in Greece, but especially in Rome. And so the humanist movement, which, and we're talking about the Renaissance here, renaissance, rebirth of the ancient world. This is what it was called. Well, that's what they basically spent their time doing. These scholars, these lawyers, these teachers, and they proposed a new ethic. Whereas the ethic of the nobles was fighting and the ethic of the church was praying, they proposed a new ethic, which was basically service in behalf of the state, just like the Romans and the Greeks of Athens. For them, service, that you distinguish yourself by an active life of service to the state. And they prize things like rationality, ambition, and so on, all, of course, for patriotic reasons. But they also would say that wealth was not a bad thing. The church always said that wealth was evil, sinful. Wealth and material pleasure was good rather than bad, said many of the humanists. And one of the things that they also also distinguished them was, well, partly out of political rivalry, but also they were very concerned at the state of the papacy in the 15th century. The papacy and the church in general had become extremely materialistic. They were power hungry. The popes, the archbishops, the bishops, as I explained, they were great landlords, and the Pope was the greatest landlord of them all. And so you see the popes basically behaving like any secular ruler. It was all about power, carving out a powerful state, power, ambition, and so on, and also raising as much money as possible. And they let the church deteriorate, especially they encouraged superstitious practices, like, for example, indulgences or the endless devotion to the saints as a way of raising money. It was you gave the priests money in order to sort of perform some sort of religious service, even a funeral. And so the church became basically a money machine in the late Middle Ages. And the humanists began to comment on all this critically. Now, the humanists who, in particular, amongst the Italians, the one who is most critical and the most famous of these humanists was a guy by the name of Machiavelli. He was a Florentine. I'm trying to. Here you go. Machiavelli. This guy, he was a humanist. He studied the classical writers, particularly the historians. But he was also very experienced in diplomacy in behalf of the Florentine state. And when he retired, or maybe I should say when he was kicked out of office, he sat down and wrote perhaps the most famous book to come out of this period. You see the year of his death, 1524. He wrote The Prince, which is still read today. It's considered a masterpiece. And what it's about is personal ambition, ruthless personal ambition. How does a prince get and preserve his power? Is basically the question that Machiavelli is asking, based on his experience. And his answer was to be as ruthless and unscrupulous as possible, while putting on a smile, while basically concealing his ambition. That was basically, he said that politics doesn't have anything to do with the morality preached by the church or by the stupid fighting of the nobles. It's all about gaining political power. And he, in a famous phrase, said, "The ends justify the means." If my end is political power, I should use any means possible in order to basically gain and retain that power. And it's obvious that Machiavelli himself, yes, he studied the classics and they said similar things, but also I think you have to realize that he was the sort of political secretary in the richest town in Europe, as to say the city of Florence, filled with merchants and bankers. And what we're talking about really is the morality of the marketplace. And he applied it to politics. And he rejected the morality of the church. He said that the popes were hypocrites because they were princes unscrupulous princess like anybody else, but they concealed it again behind an appearance of spirituality. So that's Machiavelli. But then, and of course, he was people. The book was prohibited, but virtually anybody who was influential read it in secret during the 16th century. But then in England, there arose another humanist. He was the servant. He was the first minister of Henry VIII. His name was Thomas More. And Thomas More was, well, he had his problems, but he believed, to the contrary, well, he was concerned about the common people. And he believed in a morality that served the common people. So he wrote another book. It's not as famous as The Prince. The book is called The Utopia. Utopia means nowhere. And what it is basically the outline of a perfect communist state where all material things are held in common. And the good of the community is put first. Now, this is interesting in two senses. In the contrast with Machiavelli, it's obvious, but also the fact that this is the period at the beginning of capitalism, as you know now from your studies. And no sooner does capitalism appear than somebody writes this socialist utopian work. It's an interesting juxtaposition. It's an interesting that critique of capitalism would emerge so early. So that's I'm trying to give you a little sense of the achievements of these humanists. Then the third humanist that we should note, that's noteworthy, was a guy by the name of Castiglione. And Castiglione, he served the King of Spain. And he wrote about the same time as Machiavelli. He wrote a book called The Courtier. And as I explained to you, the King of Spain, of France, and of England, they all had these enormous courts, thousands of noblemen who are no longer able to hold up in their castles. They had to come to court at the summons of the king, or they had to serve the king in his armies. So the question was, how can one succeed? Success basically depends on pleasing the king. So Castiglione wrote this book, basically how to please the king. It's what it's about. And since kings now were in these territorial states were going to dominate Europe until the French Revolution, this is an important book. And basically, Castiglione said, what you need some of the old virtues of the nobleman. You have to be brave. You have to sort of give attention to the ladies. But at the same time, you have to be civil. You have to have manners. You can't be a biker. You need to be able to use force, but you use force in combination with words to get your way. And you need an education, and the education should be the classics of Rome and Greece. So Castiglione brings this sort of humanist culture, which began in the cities, to the courts of Europe, is what I would say, and therein lies his importance. Well, the thing is that basically the image that Castiglione projects is that of the all-rounded personality. That is to say, a courtier should be able to fight, to dance, to entertain the ladies, to tell stories, to understand the basic sort of references from Plato or from Pliny or some of the classical writers. That's his image of the all-rounded gentleman. And it has a huge effect on the nobles and indeed upper-class education right through the 19th century. Castiglione is important. Now, the next and last humanist who I want to consider was very different from Castiglione, even from More and from certainly Machiavelli. His name was Erasmus. He came from Holland, began life as a monk, but he was a fantastic scholar. He knew both Latin and Greek. He studied the ancient classics, but he began to publish pamphlets, and these pamphlets were critical of European society at the time. For example, he published several pamphlets which attacked war, but these wars, which were being conducted by the nobility, were evil, were bad. And of course, that completely went against the sort of attitude of the court, of the nobles, and so on. It reflects a middle-class attitude. So you can see a sort of growing middle-class culture is what I'm driving at. But his critique of European society, just like the Italians, centered on the church. In his pamphlets, he began to say the popes are power hungry. They make war. Can you imagine the head of Christianity making constant war in Italy? There are all these superstitious practices in the church, pilgrimages, saints worship, the worship not only of Mary, but of Mary's mother, Saint Anne, and so on, when in fact, real Christianity is something very different, as I'll explain. Does anybody have any questions? So here we have Erasmus, and he then he publishes a pamphlet where he says, you know, I've been studying all these Roman and Greek writers and so on. I think I'm going to use the same methods of sort of studying the writings of the ancient world, but instead of studying the secular philosophers and poets and historians, I'm going to start to study the original documents of the Catholic Church. In other words, I'm going to study the Bible and the Church Fathers in order to discover what original Christianity or the primitive church was all about. That's the way we can, if we study these original principles of the church, we can reform the church, which was ridden by political ambition and superstition. Let's go back to the Bible. Let's go back to the great early fathers of the church, like Augustine or Jerome, and so on, and discover the original Christianity. So after many years of study, in 1516, he publishes as sort of a New Testament. The New Testament. There's the Old Testament of the Bible, and then there's the New Testament. Well, he publishes the New Testament again in 1516 in Greek and Latin. And he provides notes about the meaning of the words in the text. He's doing more or less the same thing that the Italian humanists did, but only it's being applied to these original books of the Christian religion. And at the same time, as I said, he's issuing these pamphlets which are critical of the church. And at the core of his teaching is that, based on my study of the New Testament, from everything I can learn, Christianity really boils down to the Sermon on the Mount, Christ's Sermon on the Mount, doing unto others as you would have them do unto you, being good to other people. That's the true philosophy of Christ. All the rest of it, the services of the church, lighting of candles, the huge buildings are meaningless. The main thing is charity and goodness toward other people. Well, that was a stunner. Any questions about what I said? Well, Erasmus should understand. These pamphlets, by the way, were very popular. The printed book had been invented 50 years earlier, and more people knew how to read, especially from the middle class. And so they were read avidly. But he prepared the ground for the coming of Martin Luther, who was no reformer. He was a political revolutionary. Martin Luther, political and religious revolutionary. And of course, we know that Erasmus was obviously influenced by Erasmus, but he took things in a much more radical direction. Now, Luther, like Erasmus, had been a monk, but he ultimately became a professor of theology in central Germany, in a town called Wittenberg in Saxony. And in his lectures at Wittenberg, like so many of the other humanists, he began to criticize the ambition, the power, the money obsession, the superstition which dominated the church. And as he studied further, he came to the realization that many of the practices of the Catholic Church, as a matter of fact, had no basis in the Bible. If the Bible was the original document of the church, then its practices of the Christian religion should be based on the Bible. But he realized that with the exception of baptism and basically the Lord's Supper, taking the bread and wine, there was no basis for the other 5 sacraments, to say nothing of the worship of the saints and all the rest of it. And so he came to the conclusion that basically the Bible should be the only source of authority in the church. Now, he was living a quiet life in Wittenberg, but eventually in 1517, a monk who had been sent on a special mission to Germany to raise money by the Pope arrived in Wittenberg, and basically he gave a sermon in which he promised the citizens that if they bought what was called a papal indulgence, their sins would be forgiven. You could actually buy the remission of sins by paying a fee to this monk. And so Luther said to himself, this is going too far. And he nailed up a series of 95 theses castigating this practice and castigating all of the other corruptions of the Catholic Church. And he began to basically attract more and more attention. And what he began to say was, our faith has to be based on the Bible. And the central question of our faith is, how do we achieve salvation? Well, his answer was different from Erasmus, because Erasmus said doing good work, charity was the basis for one's salvation. But Luther said, no, charity is not going to, because we're under sin, we're Christians, and all human beings are sinful. And so merely being nice is not going to get you into paradise. What you have to do is, as the teachings of the apostle St. Paul's epistles make up a significant element in the New Testament. And in that in those letters, St. Paul says, you have to, in order to save yourself, you have to basically throw yourself on the mercy of God, because the central element of Christianity is that God sent his only son to earth to die for the sins of mankind. And that's the core of Christianity. And so in order to be redeemed, in order to be saved, you have to base your hopes on having faith in the salvation message of Jesus Christ. That's what we read in the Bible. So on the one hand, he says the Bible is the only authority. Secondly, he says what becomes a doctrine called justification by faith alone. Faith alone saves. So the Bible, faith alone saves. And the third element is, hey, based on this, what's the good of the priests? The priests claim that they have a special relationship through the church with God. That's not true. It's the Bible that gives you access to God. It's not the church. And so he enunciated this doctrine called the priesthood of all believers, which means that if you have faith, if you believe in the saving message of Jesus, you will be saved. So let me review. The gospel alone, salvation by faith alone, and and the priesthood of all believers. These are the core doctrines of Martin Luther. And they are a deep heresy. He's basically saying we don't need the Catholic Church. Are there any questions? So immediately in 1521, the Pope excommunicated Martin Luther. He was expelled from the Catholic Church. And then the Emperor Charles V, who was close to the Pope, they were political allies, he declared Luther to be an outlaw. He had to be hunted down. And that you knew what that meant, that basically he would be thrown into the fire. So Martin Luther challenges the church in the ways I've explained, and the response of the Catholic authorities was making him excommunicated and an outlaw. Now, the question was, how would public opinion respond? Well, they responded, especially because this controversy, it appeared in these printed pamphlets and books. Remember the printed book, that's very important. People read, they even read these pamphlets together. And there were tens of thousands of these pamphlets published in Germany, as well as in other countries. Well, people rallied to Martin Luther. More importantly, the princes in the cities of Germany and of Scandinavia, to whom Martin Luther appealed, they said we would protect Martin Luther against the Pope and against the Emperor, because his version of the Christian religion is the true version. But you should understand that it certainly was based on a certain spirituality, but it was also a political calculation, because defying Charles V on this matter could reinforce their own independence from Charles V. So that's what happened. Basically, northern Germany and Scandinavia revolted against the Catholic Church and established this new Lutheran Protestantism as their religion. And so this was a serious blow to the papacy and to the Catholic Church, as you realize. Now, soon after Luther began to preach, a whole slew of other Protestant movements began to emerge. Luther wasn't the only one, others imitated him. So soon in France, you had a man by the name of John Calvin, who was even more, he was a more systematic thinker than Luther. I'll speak about him. And he gave the new movement a certain sort of fundamental principles. So Calvin, I'll speak about him in a minute. In Switzerland, there was a reformer by the name of Zwingli, who challenged the church in Switzerland. And of course, all over Central Europe and up into Holland, in the Netherlands, there emerged the Anabaptist movement. The Anabaptist movement, whose fundamental tenet was, we reject infant baptism. People should be baptized when they know what the religion is all about. So only they believed in adult baptism. So they were called Anabaptists. Does anybody? Well, there are a lot of Anabaptists in Manitoba. Does anybody know who they are? There's lots of them. The Mennonites and the Hutterites are Anabaptists. Finally, the last Protestant we should mention is Henry VIII, King of England, who ultimately, for political reasons, seceded from Rome. Well, also, there was the famous divorce and so on. So though that's gives you a sense of what it really meant was that the unity of the Catholic Church was broken, and politically, it meant that the power of the emperor, the capacity of the emperor to impose sort of rule over all of Europe was lost. Charles V, he was fighting the King of France, he was fighting the Turks, and he had to fight these Protestants as well. It was too much, and he couldn't impose his will. Now, I want to talk a little bit more about Calvin, because it's so important. Calvin was a French lawyer. He hoped that the then King of France, Francis I, would follow Henry VIII and would break from the Pope, from Rome. That's what he was hoping. But Francis decided, for political reasons, he would not do so and remain Catholic. And so Calvin, like other disappointed reformers, he went into exile. He left France and he moved to Switzerland, where he found refuge in the city of Geneva in 1536. Geneva was a small, what we call city-state republic. There was no prince. it was self-governing. The middle class ruled in Geneva, and Calvin basically converted the political leadership and the citizens of Geneva to the Protestant faith. But as I explained earlier, in 1536, same year, he published this basic book called the Christian Institutes. And what this is a basic manual of the Protestant religion. It outlines what are the basic teachings of Protestantism. Luther never did that. Calvin gave what I could say is a kind of a structure to the religious principles of the new religion. And furthermore, he organized the church in Geneva. He gave it a certain organization. So he organized the religious principle, but also he gave the church a very strong sort of organizational foundation. How can I find a parallel? Well, an easy parallel is if you think of the Bolsheviks during the Russian Revolution, they were great organizers. And so was Calvin. He organized the church, which it certainly had a spiritual dimension, but it also gave the Calvinists a capacity to fight back politically. So organizing the principles of the religion, organizing the political structure of the church, and finally, he imposed a strict morality on the people of Geneva. That is to say, basing himself on the Bible, he set up really a kind of moral police state, which we call Puritanism. When people basically could do nothing but work and pray, and they could not wear colorful clothes, they couldn't gamble, they couldn't drink in the taverns. No, they had to devote themselves either to religion or to their work. Indeed, Calvin and his successors went so far as to say that if people became successful in their work, it was a sign of God's favor or election. That material success suggested religious success. And this became a basic attitude of the Calvinists, it's sometimes referred to as the Protestant ethic. And many historians argue that the Calvinist form of the Protestant religion was a sort of ideology which favored the development of capitalism. Capitalism and Puritanism went hand in hand, because you don't waste any money, you save money, you dress simply, your material needs are small, and you spend your time working. It's a work discipline. So at the end of the day, you can accumulate money. Are there any questions about what I've said? Okay, well, we do have a couple of minutes left. Well, so you can see that the whole of Northern Europe, and eventually it included Scandinavia and England, Scotland, the Netherlands, most of the Netherlands, they all became Protestant. And this was the unity of the Catholic Church was broken. So things were looking really bad for the Catholics, especially for the popes. However, gradually, the Catholics, faced with the Protestants, they began to rally. The church began to reform itself with the support of certain conservative rulers, King of France, King of Spain, some of the Italian states, Austria, Bavaria. They began to sort of support, for political reasons as well as spiritual, a reform of the Catholic Church. And we call this movement the Catholic Counter-Reformation. You can see what I'm driving at. There is the Protestant Reformation, and now, starting around the 1540s, a Catholic Counter-Reformation. Now, one of the things that had already happened, and which was very important, was, of course, the Catholic conquest of Latin America. To come back to what we were saying earlier in the term, the indigenous people of Latin America, their souls were all gained for the Catholic Church, millions. So yes, the Catholics lose Germany, Northern Europe, but they gain Latin America. That sort of offsets things. That's number one. And then the popes, I think I'll stop at this point and we'll resume on Wednesday.